But this man? Nothing. Victor leaned back into his seat unfazed. Success, he continued, tapping lightly on the armrest with his fingers, is about making sure people know who you are. He lowered his voice just enough to make it sound like he was revealing some great secret that would change the man's life. That's what really matters. You see, when you walk into a room, people should immediately recognize your status. They should know you're someone important. As he said this, Victor casually looked the man up and down. His simple jacket, plain trousers, worn-out shoes that had clearly seen better days. Victor raised an eyebrow, allowing a brief flash of amusement to cross his face. If not, he said, shaking his head slightly, then what's the point? He let out a brief chuckle, waiting for some kind of reaction. But there was nothing, not even the slightest hint of discomfort. The man remained seated, unfazed, as if Victor's words meant absolutely nothing to him. Victor let out a dramatic sigh, shifting in his seat, shaking his head as though disappointed. You know, he said in a slightly mocking tone, I see this all the time. People trying to act like money doesn't matter, like they're above it all. He glanced at the man again, looking for some sign of irritation, some indication that his words were getting under his skin. But let's be honest, if you have money, you should flaunt it. Victor gestured around the opulent first-class cabin, observing the passengers dressed in custom suits and designer dresses, the crisp champagne being served in delicate glasses. He looked back at the man, almost as if explaining a simple truth to a child. The crystal glasses, the soft murmurs of high-level conversations. Victor gestured with his hand as if it were obvious. If not, people won't take you seriously, he said, leaning in slightly and lowering his voice as if sharing an important secret. Let me guess, his smile widened. You're one of those who says money isn't everything, right? He let out a brief mocking laugh before the man could respond. Look, I respect all that humble lifestyle stuff, truly, but let's be realistic. He tilted his head slightly with a look of superiority. The world runs on money. Another pause, a calculated pause. Power runs on money. He spread his hands as if stating an undeniable fact. And if you don't show it, then you'll always be invisible. For the first time since the conversation had started, the man moved, not awkwardly, not searching for words. Instead, he slowly and deliberately turned his head and looked Victor in the eye. When he spoke, his voice was calm, serene, and yet undeniably firm. True leadership isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give. The words were soft, but cut through the air like a blade. A strange stillness filled the cabin. The clinking of glasses, the soft hum of conversation, all seemed to fade into the background. For a moment, Victor blinked, caught completely off guard. He had expected a defensive attitude, a clumsy attempt at justification. What he didn't expect was this. Before Victor could speak, before he could fully process what had just happened, a voice came from a few seats away. A middle-aged woman, impeccably dressed in a business suit, who had been listening in silence, gave a small nod and murmured, "That's true." Victor's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly against the armrest. He let out a small laugh, but even to him, it sounded forced. Yeah, he said, dismissively waving a hand. That's cute and all, but let's be serious. He gestured broadly toward the luxurious first-class cabin, where a waiter in a perfectly pressed uniform served champagne to a passenger without a second thought. Do you think anyone here got into first class by giving things away? He pointed to another passenger, a man wearing a thick gold chain, a pricey briefcase, and a custom-made suit worth more than some cars. Look at him. His voice took on a conspiratorial tone, as though explaining something obvious to a child. Do you think he built his business by simply giving things away? No, he took what was his. That's how the world works. You seize opportunities, you build wealth, you show power. Victor leaned back, crossing his arms, waiting for his words to sink in. But the man beside him didn't argue. He didn't defend himself, didn't even seem upset. And for some reason that bothered Victor more than anything. Why wasn't this man reacting like everyone else? Most people, when challenged, tried to prove themselves. They would defend themselves, explain why they were right. But this man just sat there, calm, impassive, almost as if he knew something Victor didn't. Victor's stomach churned slightly. For the first time, a thought slipped into his mind, a thought he didn't like. What if he was wrong? He quickly rejected it. No, he couldn't be wrong. But why did he feel like he was losing control? Victor's frustration had been rising for the last hour. It didn't matter what he said, how many times he showed off his Rolex, adjusted his custom-made suit, or emphasized the importance of wealth. The man beside him remained unfazed. Victor had given him every opportunity to react, to show discomfort, insecurity, or any recognition that he didn't belong in this realm. But nothing, not even a flinch, not a moment of hesitation. And that's what made Victor's blood boil. It wasn't just that the man was ignoring his attempts to assert dominance. It was the ease with which he did so. It was as if Victor's presence, his words, his entire philosophy on success meant absolutely nothing to him. Victor clenched his jaw and his fingers tightened around the armrest of his seat. He looked at the man again. There was no anxiety, no signs of being intimidated or impressed, no nervousness, no desperate attempt to explain himself. There was only calm, absolute, unshakable calm, and Victor hated it. He opened his mouth ready to press further, to force a reaction. "Excuse me, sir," he began, but his words died in his throat as a flight attendant appeared next to them. At first, she didn't react. Flight attendants were always polite in first class, trained to serve the elite, to make them feel important. But then Victor noticed something different. Her posture, her tone. There was no generic courtesy, no empty politeness in her voice. There was respect, genuine, unmistakable respect. Not the kind given to first-class passengers, but the kind reserved for people of true importance. Victor watched, his expression freezing as she turned to the man beside him, offering him a warm smile, almost a different smile. Then she spoke. "Mr. Jimin," she said softly, "the captain has asked me to inform you that your connecting flight has been arranged. He also wanted to personally greet you." A heavy, almost palpable silence swept over the cabin. Victor's smile faltered. His expression, once filled with arrogance and amusement, stiffened into something unreadable. His mind began to race. Jimin? She had just said Jimin, as in Jimin from BTS? Something in Victor's chest tightened, and his breath caught in his throat. A cold realization began to claw at the edges of his mind, but he refused to believe it. No, it couldn't be. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. But despite himself, he swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady, though it came out shaky. "You mean Jimin? As in Jimin from BTS?" His heart was pounding now as he turned to look at the man beside him. The same man he had spent the entire flight mocking, belittling, lecturing on wealth and power. The same man he had assumed was beneath him. The same man he had treated as though he didn't belong. In response, the man simply smiled. A simple, knowing smile. Then, with effortless composure, he nodded at Victor. Victor's breath caught, his whole body tensed. And in that moment, everything collapsed around him. The arrogance, the condescension, the superiority with which he had carried himself throughout the flight, shattered. This wasn't just anyone sitting next to him. This was Jimin from BTS, a global superstar, someone whose influence and success went far beyond anything Victor could comprehend. He wasn't just anyone. He wasn't someone inferior to him. He wasn't someone who didn't belong in first class. He was the leader of an entire country, a man who had transformed a nation, a man who had made headlines around the world, a man who had earned global respect. And Victor had spent the entire flight trying to lecture him about success. Victor felt sick. His stomach twisted painfully. He had spent the whole flight giving lessons on wealth and power to a world leader, a self-made billionaire, trying to teach a president about influence. And now everyone knew it. The other first-class passengers who had previously ignored the conversation no longer pretended to be disinterested. Now they were staring at him with wide eyes, some in awe, some with hidden amusement, and others with silent judgment, watching Victor squirm in his own humiliation. He could feel the weight of their gazes. The change in the atmosphere was undeniable. He was no longer the most important person in the room. For the first time in his life, Victor wasn't the one in control. His mind screamed for him to say something to fix this, to undo the mess he had created. But what was there to say? What could he say to undo the shame, the humiliation, the sheer irony of the situation? Victor had built his entire life around one belief: money equals power. It was a belief that had shaped everything he did, that had justified his arrogance, that had made him feel untouchable. Yet here he was, face to face with a man who had more power than he could ever dream of, someone who had never felt the need to prove it. Victor's throat went dry, his heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in his life, he was speechless. His face burned, not from the warmth of confidence or the satisfaction of dominance, but from pure, unshakable shame. For as long as he could remember, he had lived his life untouched by humility. He had always been the one with the most elegant suit, the biggest bank account, the loudest voice in the room. But now he felt small. The superiority that had been his armor, the unshakable belief that wealth made him untouchable, the certainty that money was the ultimate measure of power. Everything had been shattered, and it only took a moment to destroy everything he had built his identity on. Victor had spent the entire flight lecturing a world leader about success. He had looked down on a man who had transformed an entire nation. He had mocked someone he thought was beneath him, believing himself to be more powerful, more important, simply because he wore expensive clothes and owned luxury goods. And now he felt like a fool. He turned toward Jimin, and his smile disappeared completely. There was no smile, no arrogant smugness, no self-satisfied amusement, only shame. Victor felt a lump form in his throat. He swallowed hard, but nothing could ease the growing knot in his chest. He began, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. His mind, once sharp, always ready with a witty comeback, always prepared to put others in their place, was now blank. He took a deep breath and tried again. "I have no idea," he finally whispered. The truth was, he didn't know. He had never even considered the possibility, because in his world, people were defined by their appearance, by their wealth, by what they could show. He had never stopped to think that real power didn't need to be displayed. Jimin simply smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a look of satisfaction from having the upper hand, just a simple knowing smile, the kind of smile from a man who had nothing to prove. Then, in the same calm and steady voice that had unsettled Victor from the beginning, he said, "It doesn't matter. What matters is how quickly we judge others." Victor felt those words strike deep within him because Jimin was right. How many times had he done it? How many times had he looked at someone's clothes, their appearance, and assumed they were beneath him? How many times had he mocked people who didn't fit into his definition of success? He had never stopped to consider who they really were. Victor had spent his entire life believing that power was something to be shown off, that if you didn't flaunt your wealth, you didn't matter. But Jimin had just taught him something that shook him to his core. True power doesn't need to be displayed. True success doesn't require validation. And respect isn't bought, it's earned. Those words echoed in Victor's mind as the plane began its descent. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their arrival. Victor took a deep breath. He had never felt like this before. Everything he had believed, everything his life had been built on, was crumbling as the plane prepared to land. He turned toward Jimin one last time. His voice was different now, softer, more genuine. "I'm sorry," he said, "not just for who you are, Jimin, not just because I spent the flight embarrassing myself, but because for the first time in my life, I realize how blind I've been." Jimin nodded. "Apologizing is a start," he said, "but the most important thing is what you learn from it." Victor felt that sentence hit him like a ton of bricks. Would he leave the plane, go back to his old ways, forget this moment, and continue believing that wealth defines a person's value? Or would he change for real? The plane landed, and passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. Victor stayed still, his mind racing. He watched as Jimin stood, elegant and serene, the same man he had been since the moment he boarded the plane. Victor had never seen anyone like him. Not just a politician, not just a rich man, not just a leader. A man who had just changed his entire perspective on life. As Jimin made his way toward the exit, he smiled. The same warm, humble smile he had given to the flight attendants, the passengers, and even to Victor. And in that moment, Victor understood something he had never understood before. Jimin didn't need to prove his worth because true power wasn't about money, luxury, or status. It was about how you treated people. For the first time in his life, Victor wanted to be better. As Jimin exited the plane, Victor watched him leave. Deep down, he knew this was a lesson he would never forget. The true power isn't in what you have, but in how you treat people. And that, my friends, is a lesson we should all remember. As soon as he entered first class, heads turned, but not with admiration. Dressed simply, with no flashy jewelry or designer suits, he contrasted sharply with the wealthy elite surrounding him. One man in particular, Victor Harding, sneered at the sight. He had no idea who he was insulting, but he was about to find out in the most humiliating way possible. Before we get into it, I bet you can't watch this video until the end. It's too intense, too shocking, most people can't handle it, but if you do, prove me wrong by commenting "I did" at the end. Also, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and while you're here, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you never miss a story that will leave you speechless. Now let's get into it. We all know that type of person, the ones who believe their wealth and status put them above others. Victor Harding was no exception. A self-made millionaire, he was used to luxury, privilege, and making sure everyone knew his name. But that day, in the confined space of first class, he made a crucial mistake. He judged a man by his appearance. When the flight landed, Victor was speechless, humiliated, and forced to confront the truth about real power. Victor Harding lived by a single unshakable belief: money equals power. To him, the world was divided into two types of people: those with wealth and status, and those without. In his opinion, the latter didn't deserve to share space with the former, let alone in first class. Seated in his luxurious leather seat, Victor surveyed the cabin like a king inspecting his kingdom. Everything in this section of the plane spoke of exclusivity: the polished wood finishes, champagne glasses on gleaming trays, the soft murmur of conversations among the important people. Then his gaze landed on him, a man who entered the first-class cabin with a calm and discreet air, wearing nothing to indicate wealth. He wasn't in a custom suit, carrying a luxury briefcase, or wearing polished designer shoes. Instead, he wore only a simple dark jacket, plain trousers, and shoes that had seen better days. No Rolex, no cufflinks, no signs that he belonged to the elite. Victor's eyes narrowed for a brief moment. Confusion reflected on his face. Who was this man? A mistake? A flight attendant? A lottery winner who had squandered his prize on a first-class bill? Victor smirked in satisfaction. He had seen it before. People trying to play the part, desperately hoping to blend in with the rich and powerful, but failing miserably. His gaze continued to study the man, his mind working quickly to find an explanation for why he was here. He found nothing, and that irritated him. Victor leaned back in his seat, letting out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. When the man passed by him, he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "First class, huh? I guess they're loosening the access requirements lately." His words hung in the air like a challenge. Several passengers glanced subtly at them, some pretending to look at their phones or adjust their seats. But Victor could feel their curiosity. However, the man, who should have felt embarrassed, uneasy, or off balance, simply turned his head and locked eyes with Victor. There was no change in posture, no defensive expression, no awkward attempt to explain himself, just a calm, serene gaze, and a response so casually confident that it sent a small, inconvenient shiver down Victor's spine. The world is full of surprises. That was all. No apologies, no justification, no desperate attempt to prove his worth. Victor blinked for a fraction of a second, feeling something he wasn't used to feeling. A pause, a moment where he wasn't the one in control, and he hated it. He let out a small laugh, shaking off the brief moment of unease. This wasn't the reaction he expected. Normally, when Victor made comments like that, people would react, shift uncomfortably, avoid eye contact, even stammer out an excuse. Some would nervously laugh, trying to cover up their discomfort. But he always saw the insecurity. But this guy, nothing. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. This game wasn't working. People like him, the ones who had worked hard for their fortune, built their empires, were supposed to be in control. They dictated the social order. Yet here was this nobody sitting there, acting like they were equals. Victor refused to let it go. He wasn't done yet. He crossed his arms, leaned forward slightly, and let his voice take on a tone of playful condescension. "Don't take it the wrong way," he began with a satisfied smile. "Of course, I'm serious. It's just that people in first class tend to have a certain level, a certain presence." He let his eyes once again scan the man's simple, unremarkable outfit, shaking his head in silent disbelief. The unspoken message was clear. "You don't belong here." Victor waited. He expected the shift in posture, the slight flinch, the flicker of discomfort in the man's eyes. He waited for him to stammer some excuse to try to justify his presence in first class. He expected him to react like everyone else did. But the man didn't budge. He gave no explanations, didn't defend his place. Instead, he remained seated, silent, still, carefree. And then, just a small smile. Not an arrogant smile, not a smile of superiority, just a calm, knowing smile, as if he were watching a child throwing a tantrum over a toy it thought was theirs. Victor's smile faltered, just for a second. The lack of response did something Victor wasn't prepared for. It unsettled him. This man wasn't playing along. He wasn't trying to justify himself, trying to prove his place in first class. He didn't need to. And for the first time, Victor felt something shift. The other passengers weren't openly involved, but Victor could feel them listening now, stealing subtle glances, waiting to see how the interaction would unfold. Victor wasn't used to this. He was the one who dictated the conversation. He was the one who set the social hierarchy. And yet, here he was, feeling like the one being studied, feeling like this man knew something he didn't, like somehow he was losing control. Victor gripped the armrest slightly. No, he wouldn't allow this. If this man wasn't going to respond the way he was supposed to, then Victor would make him react. Victor Harding wasn't one to let things slide. He was a man who thrived on dominance, making sure everyone knew their place. And when someone refused to follow his rules, he saw it as a challenge. Victor never backed down from a challenge. So if this man wasn't going to respond the way most people did, with discomfort, nervous laughter, or some weak attempt at justification, then Victor would simply force a reaction. Victor adjusted his position in the seat, making a show of stretching his legs, crossing one over the other. He exhaled loudly enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. Then, with a calculated move, he lifted his wrist, subtly tilting it so his diamond Rolex caught the light. The movement wasn't subtle. He didn't want it to be. The watch, a limited edition piece worth more than most people earned in a year, was a silent message. This was power. He was satisfied that the man beside him had noticed. Victor let a smug smile curve on his lips before speaking. "You know," Victor began, his voice carrying that practiced mix of casual arrogance. "It's funny." He turned slightly towards the man, eyeing him closely, waiting for any flicker of emotion. "People always think success comes from working hard." He let out a small laugh, as if the very idea amused him. "But let me tell you something. That's only half of the story." A brief pause, a calculated pause. But the man remained silent, his posture, his expression, completely unreadable. Victor's jaw clenched slightly. He wasn't used to this. Most people engaged with him, either out of admiration or intimidation.